Hello everyone, my name is Ben and welcome back to PASSTHEauxCORD, a channel where it has been a year. 2020 in my personal life, and I feel like in the world at large, is still not going down without a fight, as I see more and more things pop up, both in my life, as I said, and on the broader spectrum of things. But today we're not here to talk about any of that. We're here to give a mention to 50 of the records that made it a little bit better for us here. 50 albums that are still worth checking out. First off, I want to throw out a couple honorable mentions here real quick. The first one I want to give a mention to is the new 100 gecs remix album, 1000 gecs and the Tree of Clues. Now, this is my favorite remix album of all time, and that's saying something considering I'm wearing a Linkin Park hoodie. I really appreciated the collaborations that happen on here. Tons of really great remixes, both instrumentally and in just the vocal performances and the new verses that were added onto everything. Some of these songs barely even resemble the original versions in any way, shape, or form, but at the same time, that makes this all the more effective, because why would I want just another helping of worse versions of the original tracks like most remix albums are? Nope, they took it to another level entirely with this one, and I totally give them credit for that. The reason that it doesn't end up on the list, though, is just because I feel like a remix album doesn't necessarily have a place on a list like this, which are all fresh, brand new studio album content. It just doesn't quite work right, and that's all I really have to say on that front of things. I would put it on here. It'd probably be in the top 20 if it was eligible, I guess, but I don't really feel that it is. My second honorable mention I want to give here is Zilkami and Sauce Mula, City Morgue with Toxic Boogaloo. Now, I did like this project quite a bit. I did enjoy it. There's a reaction showing you guys all just how much I enjoyed listening to it, and I did come back to it a few times this year. But at the end of the day, I don't think that it can really find its way onto this list for the pure fact alone that it kind of seems like another helping of exactly what they were doing on Volume 1, this time around with some slightly heavier, more metal-leaning production, but at the same time cornier lyrics to kind of balance that out. So while they did try a couple different things on this new record of theirs, I hope to see even more innovation going into Volume 3 in this year. My third honorable mention here is Joji with Nectar. Now, this has my favorite singles of the year, but it just doesn't have the full album experience, not one that I come back to in that capacity. I take the highlights of this album and re-listen to those very frequently. I've talked about the highlights in another video already, and I said basically the same thing about this then. There are certain songs on here that I cannot remember when I look at the track list, meaning that it just can't really land on here. Two more that were just kind of ineligible, though. The first of those being A.G. Cook's 7G. Now, I don't really feel like this is a fair competitor, given that it is more 7 fun-sized miniature albums put into one, rather than one album on its own merit. It honestly even feels more so like something like a mixtape, you know? I can even lean on putting something like that on here, but this is literally broken up into 7 different discs. It just doesn't feel right to do anything when it's such unfair competition, because you have so many songs to impress me with. And it did. This is a really cool project, and one that I would recommend at 2.5 hours, which isn't something that commonly happens whatsoever. I'm not usually one to enjoy longer projects, but I really enjoyed this longer project. And big props for having 2 of the most unique and creative covers I've ever heard. One of them is on a Strokes song, so you guys might want to go check that one out. And final honorable mention I want to throw out here before I'm done rambling about them is Panchiko's Death Metal, a really, really great, solid album that I've revisited countless times since my initial reaction video here on the channel. One that I really enjoyed a lot. It is such a different project from anything you really hear in terms of psychedelic pop and rock music. Definitely leaning far more on that rock side of things on this one, of course, here. But the reason I can't put it on here, and again, it would be very high if I did, is that it was more discovered this year than it was actually released this year. It was re-released this year in the most commercial fashion that it's ever been released. But I do recommend looking into the backstory of this album and then looking into the album itself, because both are very interesting. So finally, it is time to get onto the actual list. Now, we're going to blast through the first 30 of these, much like I did on my worst albums for the first 10, so we can get to the big hard hitters a little bit faster, and I'm just going to give some quick thoughts on the ones before that. Again, we're not going to be like transitioning these too crazy or anything, but at number 50 we have Horse Lords The Common Task, their debut album, and it is a very interesting experimental math and psych rock experience, one that certainly feels like a journey. There are lots of textures and progressions that I did not expect to hear on here, and it also has the longest song of the year that I enjoyed, so big props on that. This 19-minute track is one that I actually come back to. But next up is the semi-self-titled from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard called KG, a brand new take on their microtonal style, testing out some different things that they haven't necessarily done before, and I do think that it makes the songs come across in a much more hard-hitting way than some of their other microtonal stuff, almost in the way that Infest the Rat's Nest did, but still having that different sound that wasn't leaning on thrash metal. Now, my only problem with this album is the mixing, and that's certainly something you cannot say for number 48, Tame Impala with The Slow Rush, the newest work from Kevin Parker on here, because this record is made complete by the mixing, as you would expect from a Tame Impala album at this point. This does embrace some of the best aspects of his sound that he's put forward yet. There's some longer, moodier tracks and some much more upbeat, danceable tracks on here. Really kind of the best of both worlds as far as that goes, although I do think that it's a bit of a step down from Currents. It's still such a great record. And we have another promising debut at number 47 with Lil Darky's new album, This Does Not Exist, in all caps, of course. And I think that the edginess surrounding this record is something that really turns a lot of people off from it, and if anybody knows a damn thing about me, they know that I'm very edgy regardless, so of course this is just my cup of tea. But really, in contrast to what I think a lot of people say about the lack of substance possibly even on here, I think that this release is actually very strong in its lyrical substance, and I think that too many people overlook him and don't give him enough credit for this, but he's definitely leaning on both sides here with this kind of acoustic emo trap style as well as a little bit of the rap metal, and he's taking both of those newer styles that kind of blend rock and rap music, but taking a totally fresh take on it, because this album sounds so much more fresh than a lot of the stuff that has came out of those very oversaturated genres. So whether he's being calm or making the musical equivalent to cocaine, this album was pretty entertaining for me. Number 46, we have Coda the Friends' new album, Everything. And this is one of the best records in recent time that I would call chill rap. Coda is bringing the vibes as he brings himself into the mainstream in a surprising turn of events that has led him to some pretty big collaborators. I'm really excited to see where he goes next. Number 44 is Dance Gavin Dance's new album, Afterburner, one of the most controversial and polarizing bands in the metalcore scene, in kind of this neo-emo kind of vibe, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it. I think what a lot of people might hate them for is what I love them for, that being their lack of self-seriousness when approaching this somewhat heavier but still sweet sound. I have the Weedly gene, okay? There's just nothing else to say about it. Number 43 is going to be the new album from Everything Everything called Reanimator. This one I have a pretty unique relationship with. I only really stumbled across it, not because I knew the band or anything like that, but just because I thought the cover looked cool. And upon first listen, I was hearing some Radiohead influenced pop rock, art pop kind of music, but on further listens I realized there was a lot more going on here than just that. This listen really requires a patient listener who is able to kind of pick apart the music as they're hearing it, because that's when you start to get kind of this magical feeling that it brings about. I think if you give it the time of day, this album will impress you. Number 42, we've got Amine's new album, Limbo. Amine, for a while now, has been one of the most promising up-and-coming faces in modern rap. And on this album, he does bring much of what you would expect for a lot of it, that being his very smooth trademark flow and charisma, the very personality-driven kind of rap style that he regularly brings, but especially in production, this album does a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to, meaning that he's actually progressing a lot as an artist. Number 41, I gave to Dogleg with their new album Melee. My love for this album and this band's work in particular probably comes from my love of early 2000s post-hardcore, much like bands like La Dispute. What I really love about this, though, is that it doesn't really seem like the other bands where they're merely imitating that sound, that style that is mostly dead at this point, but they actually seem to be breathing some new life into that style, into that genre, having their own take on it, and still making it feel just as impactful as it once was. Number 40, Kelly Lee Owens, my first time hearing her music on Inner Song. This has some really interesting, enjoyable, unique sampling techniques especially, and it just created some textures that I thought were very engaging. These songs create an atmosphere of their own that has a ton of individuality. That does mean that it sacrifices consistency ever so slightly throughout the runtime, as these songs are very split apart from each other, but at the same time that is a very worthy sacrifice because of just how unique these songs feel. At number 39, we have Blue and Exile with Miles. This duo, this collaboration here really brought a great project this year. Blue writes on a very personal level and sometimes a very worldwide issue kind of topic seeking way, tackling some very relevant topics, but no matter what he is writing about, he's writing about it very cleverly. He is a very skilled wordsmith, and one that I'm very glad that I've heard music from now, because his writing is just great. His pen game is all there on this project, and his flows, his delivery, all very impressive stuff as well. But I just think that he comes across very likable in no matter what context he is talking. And Exile is definitely one of the best in the game, doing this style of beats with these kind of retro and jazzy styles going on. Number 38, I walked in expecting a pretty generic trap record that might have had some bangers on it, but I walked out getting one of the best experimental hip-hop albums of the year with Zebra Cat's new record, Less is More. Zebra Cats has made sure that he is a name that you will be paying attention to with this new album, and if you haven't heard it yet, you definitely should, because it is some extremely well-made, dirty, nocturnal, freaky, danceable rap music with a heavy experimental edge. At number 37, we have Pigs, 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 Viscerals. Pigs Times 7 really brought a great project this year, because I did not expect to like a project in any way that was influenced by stoner metal and psych rock and post-punk, but taking all of those influences in the way that they did and putting them together really brought a great project this year. Never until the day I heard this did I think I would be intimidated by someone going on a diet, but here we are, and here we have arrived at number 36 with Rico Nasty's new album, Nightmare Vacation. On this one, she still keeps her more aggressive style, but she's doing so over much more sugary, sweet, but still kind of heavy and hard-leaning production, much of which taking from the hyper pop style, including production from Dylan Brady. Now, the only shame about it is the fact that he didn't produce every single track on here, because those are definitely the best ones, but still there are countless highlights outside of those few tracks, those handful right there, and she still is serving up banger after banger on some very different production than she's really rapped over before. At number 35, we have the latest entry from King Cruel called Man Alive. Alive, a record that is a very solid addition to a already solid discography, this being his third official album under that name. But what I find really interesting about the context of this record in 2020 is that he kind of managed to hit that feeling of the quarantine loneliness and isolation before it had really even began this year. This is a pretty similar aesthetic to what he has usually taken up on the previous two records, so you do know what to expect going into it if you've heard his other records to a certain extent at the very least. But at the same time, I think he gets better and better at it every time he tries it out, meaning that this record is just a really great entry in that already, like I said, already solid discography. And the next one up here, we do have The Killers with Imploding the Mirage, a band that I don't really care for most of the time, but I really did on this new record from them. I thought that this was a great release from them and some of their best stuff yet. Even reaching back from that stuff that's now pretty much considered classic, I think that it tops most of that. This heavenly, ethereal set of love-based rock songs just sounds like it is coming down from above the clouds. It just exists in this very ascending sort of way that was really cool. Now at number 33, we have the new record from Boston Manor called Glue, and this isn't necessarily the masterpiece I was hoping for after probably my favorite, if not one of my top three, I guess, records of 2018 being Welcome to the Neighborhood by the same band. They did experiment more with their sound on here, and I did appreciate that quite a bit, but at the same time, it made for their best and worst songs yet. But the fact of the matter is, I didn't mind any of the worst ones. They just kind of exist here, and when you hit the highlights, oh, the highlights on here really, really hit well. So I did enjoy all of it, and if you enjoy it as well, I would definitely recommend checking out their first project too, because there's such solid work between the two records. Number 32, Caliuchis with Sin Miedo, a smooth, sexy set of R&B, experimental pop bangers. It seems more and more influenced by that progressive pop movement that does take a little bit more experimentation as you go along, meaning that some of these tracks are pretty regular and kind of what you would expect from this type of Latin pop music, but some of them take totally different directions as well that really kept it fresh and interesting with a ton of different kinds of tracks, all being ones that I enjoyed quite a bit. At number 31, we have Young Lean, proving that he is still the top of class in cloud rap on his new album. And this new album, Stars, does really sound like the acid at 7-Eleven that he talks about taking on one track. And a similarly psychedelic experience is number 30, American Head by the Flaming Lip. This album is really interesting to me because it's both very depressing but simultaneously uplifting and dreamlike in both its lyrics and its sound. And they still have this bright blend of psychedelia that just has not been matched by anyone else. At number 29, it's the new album from Taylor Swift, Folklore. Taylor strips it way back to her and her acoustic guitar for most of this record, creating a very simplistic sound and style of listen on here, one that was totally unexpected, but does kind of represent the quarantine aesthetic, I guess. For something so simple and deconstructed, it really shouldn't have remained so entertaining for 70 plus minutes, but it does, and I think that most of that comes down to her really great lyricism, storytelling, and just mellow atmospheres that you can sink your way into. At number 28, we have the new release from Deerhoof, definitely one of the most creative things I've heard, which never fails to be the case with Deerhoof, one of the most creative bands I've ever heard of. This is beautifully strange and outlandish, but it's so hard not to smile while listening to it. It just has such a likable, enjoyable, almost childlike, I guess, vibe to it, but it's just so much fun. At number 27, The Butcher is indeed coming, and he's coming with some cold, hard bangers on Benny the Butcher's new album called Burden of Proof. his best work yet, that has numerous hard-hitting flows and hard-hitting beats, and extra credit to him for landing a couple slower cuts near the end of the album. And at number 26, we've got Kari's debut album, following a lot of very promising projects, including EPs and mixtapes. This one's called This Is Weird, what has become somewhat of his catchphrase over the years. His debut album is finally here, and to much fanfare, as deserving, because this is probably the best rendition yet of his introspective pop rap song. This has some of his best moments of lyricism, writing overall, singing, and rapping all throughout. And this definitely disproves my rule of messy album rollouts being messy albums 100% of the time, because this album rollout was full of turmoil, to say the least. But what we did end up with here is pretty great, and I do totally recommend going and showing Kari some love. Number 25, we've got Eve Toomer with Heaven for a Tortured Mind. And this is one of the first records taking up some of those vintage R&B and pop aesthetics coming straight out of the 80s that I noticed this year, which was kind of a big movement that kept happening. And this style of production is always fun to listen to and always a great addition to a record. But what really gets me is this incredibly soulful, beautiful performance that is put together all over it, and every track has so much emotion put into it. And at number 24, we have yet another record that definitely embraced those aesthetics on After Hours by The Weeknd. This is definitely the biggest record to come out this year that embraced those aesthetics as well, and one that I thought that, again, I would be a little bit more impressed by based on the singles, but unlike that Joji album that we talked about a while back now, this definitely still gave me a really great whole entire listen. Thankfully, this record still really impressed me with this pairing of the Weeknd kind of dark, moody aesthetic and these 80s vibes, okay? Really a great listen, but that is no mystery to anyone at this point. 23, I'm gonna give to Bright Eyes with their album Down in the Weeds Where the World Once Was, a pretty wordy title for a pretty lonely and heartbroken record. Definitely one of the ones this year more leaning on that side of things. Definitely focusing on a lot of the more depressing moods we may have felt this year. There's so many emotional gut punch lines on here that are very much so worth a tear or two. And the calm, mellow, depressive, folky instrumentation on this record makes it feel all the more sincere and relatable. 22, Freddie Gibbs and Madlib with Alfredo, their very cleverly titled pairing and collaboration, one that was originally kind of in competition with Benny the Butcher for the best crack rap album of the year, but at the end of the day, I think that there's really no contest between the two, because on some re-listens, we definitely have a clear winner here. The Alchemist does great on here, as being a person who serves up a lot of these, again, kind of classic sounding, kind of dusty sounding, but still pretty badass rap beats. And Freddie matches this energy just as well as you would think that he does, serving up that real hardcore rap grittiness. And at 21, just below the top 20 line, we have the self-titled by Leanne LaHavas. R&B, pop, and soul singer-songwriter brought together her very, very fitting self-titled record, and I say that it's very fitting because of just how personal it feels and how much into her emotions this seems to reach. The simple but jazzy production on here also just allows her voice to cascade through the tracks in a very nice way that just makes it feel all the more intimate. And now we're cracking down to the top 20 of the best ones on here, ones that I cannot recommend enough, ones that you should definitely go give a listen to, and here they are with number 20. The Garden, Kiss My Super Bowl Ring. First of my big keepers is one that I was pretty much guaranteed to enjoy, as there's no way around me enjoying a hyperpop and punk fusion. I also have loved pretty much everything I've heard from The Garden in the past, so that had it going for it as well. In the best way possible, this album sounds like its cover, even if that might be a little bit of an insult at first glance, because it is very messy and very chaotic, That sword in the middle, though, really makes you not mind it at all and spells adventure for the rest of the listen. This holds their most heavy riffs, their most banging instrumentals, and their catchiest tracks to date as well. I have so many of the hooks just flowing through my head as I say all of this. It's very odd and freakish, but at the end of the day, it ends up being pretty relatable, especially in its lyricism as well. Number 19, Code Orange, Underneath. Code Orange is one of the biggest names in the underground hardcore and metalcore scene, and rightfully so, as on their last album especially, and even albums before that, they have brought this uncompromising, crushingly heavy, and very hard as nails sound and aesthetic that opened the pits wide and made the speakers start to smoke. And again, even if their last record was extremely great for all of those reasons, this one just needed to do something a little bit different if they wanted to stay an interesting band and one that people want to pay a lot of attention to, rather than just another one of these heavy bands. And that is exactly what they did as they incorporated more electronic and futuristic sounds into this new aesthetic that they brought for the record, but certainly not in a danceable or poppy way in any way, shape, or form. It's far more leaning on something cold and industrial, feeling just as tortured and dark as it did before, if not even more so. Number 18, Creeper, Sex, Death, and the Infinite Void. This is a band that I've been meaning to check out and I've heard some good things about, but I'm very glad that I decided to hop on with their music at what seems to be their career highlights so far. Much of my enjoyment of this record, again, comes from some of the music that I grew up with or I was enjoying while my taste in music was developing, as this takes a somewhat traditional take at pop punk, especially reminding me of albums like The Black Parade. But besides all of that, it has a very emotional and sentimental feel to it, and there's some really great lyricism on here that makes it hit even better. The consistency on here is nice as well. I really enjoyed the concept that they had running through the record. If you grew up on pop punk like me at all, you will definitely enjoy this record. Number 17, The Strokes, The New Abnormal. The Strokes are back after almost a decade with a very triumphant return, keeping it at a tight 9 tracks long. This made for 9 of their best songs ever. Rick Rubin's legendary production shines through on just how well executed everything on this album is too. It's crazy to see how this is such a conceptual masterpiece after how messy Come Down Machine was previously. Some of my favorite catchy and immersive singles from The Strokes come from this album too. Overall, a very fitting return, and in my opinion, their best since their debut album. Number 16, Proto Martyr, Ultimate Success Today. What is being called Proto Martyr's final album is also their best. This harrowing and hair-raising set of rock tracks is sure to leave you intrigued and disturbed. The atmosphere on here is gory and disgusting. This highlights some of life's gruesome truths unapologetically and very coldly in the way that a lot of their music does. I'm sure this hits exactly what the band was going for with the trajectory they were headed in. This does hold the same sound and style as their previous releases, but just pushes it a little bit further than any of those ever did, making for the best listen yet on here. Number 15, Backwash, God Has Nothing to Do with This, Leave Him Out of It. A similarly disturbing and wordily but accurately titled album comes from Backwash this year. This is a tight, claustrophobic listen, coming in at 22 minutes with not a single one of those minutes wasted. This is falling under the horrorcore label a lot, but it seems like it transcends that into something different entirely, embracing a lot of industrial and noise music properties, and even some black metal leaning tendencies. I almost want to call this something like black metal trap, and if that's the genre that this is kind of innovating for, I really like this genre, and it kicks horrorcore's ass. Because this is actually somewhat frightening at times, and at least legitimately blasphemous in its style. This again just takes some very different elements that you don't usually hear in especially traditional rap music, and uses them in a very creative way that I enjoyed a lot. This does play with sound in some very creative ways that just give you shivers. But beyond the horror-based style that this takes up, a lot of the lyrics on here are actually introspective, actually pretty serious and relatable at times. There's some very real stuff on here, a lot about individuality, a lot about identity, a lot about mental health explained on here, and stuff that I think that people could relate to and find some comfort in while having this very empowering mood behind it. Number 14, Fiona Apple, Fetch the Bolt Cutters. The most critically acclaimed record of the year is one that didn't hit quite that hard for me, but still obviously did a number to impress me. I think that Fiona brought together a record here that has a load of significance and importance that is already showing less than a year later. This record is pretty simple in its overall structure and sound and the way that it's all developed, but it just hits so perfectly with every element that it brings out. The song structures on here are also pretty amazing, bringing some great refrains and some very satisfying conclusions to tracks. Her knack for lyricism, though, is really what pushes it over for me from being an album I like to an album I love, and I feel like that's the case for many others as well. Her storytelling, either lavish descriptions or, on the contrary, very blunt descriptions and very blunt ways of saying things, really make this have a lot of personality, and I enjoyed that a lot on here, and I think it's a lot of what makes this album as great as it is. Number 13, Logic, No Pressure. Another record that is said to be an artist's last, much like the Proto-Martyr one we already looked at, is Logic's grand finale and sequel to one of his best albums, Under Pressure. It's great that he turned his career trajectory around here and made something very impressive after a set of very disappointing albums. Because this is an incredibly impressive send-out, Logic feels so human here rather than the corny robot he seemed to be impersonating on the other albums before it. His technical skill is very present on here, but that's not something I would necessarily come to Logic for. Not something that's really all that important in general in this day and age. What's very important is just the amount of personality and relatability he puts forward on this record, and just how human, again, he feels. And that's probably because he's writing from a personal point of view rather than a point of view that's merely trying to be uplifting and inspirational. The production here is also great, some of the best stuff that I have heard him rap over ever. This team up with No ID went very well, just like it went on Under Pressure, the predecessor to this sequel, and the sound here is very similar to that record, which could not be more of a compliment. Number 12, Charlie XCX, How I'm Feeling Now. So many artists become more and more poppy and mainstream as they go along, for better or for worse, but it's been pretty entertaining to see just how far opposite Charlie's career has been. It's definitely for the best, because the more experimental and unique her music gets, the more I enjoy it. She really got together some of the best hyperpop producers in the scene for this one, with many tracks being produced by either Dylan Brady or A.G. Cook, a couple of my favorites for sure. Those do certainly make for some of her best songs yet, but of course, outside of the production on this album being absolutely amazing, this wouldn't really be anything without Charlie's character and charisma and delivery and way of writing her songs that has always been very present in her music and very noticeable. Her writing perfectly embodies the quarantine vibe while still having a somewhat lighthearted look at it. I'm glad that besides this being a quarantine album, everybody was still able to get together to make this as great as it ended up being. Number 11, Jeff Rosenstock, No Dream. Now this may stick out like a sore thumb in this list as being the only 8 in a sea of 9s as far as what I gave it on my personal rating scale, but I have replayed this album numerous times throughout the year to feel a little bit less alone in the loneliness and frustration of this year, including many of the same stressors Jeff talks about. On here he focuses on some very relevant topics like the political corruption that we do see in this year, but he also gets very introspective on here as well, and that is the way that most of it goes, but it very much so sounds more personal with this deconstructed pop punk style that is very driven by nostalgia. All through that catharsis though, he manages to still make this a very fun listen and especially a relatable listen, which I do give him a ton of credit for. Number 10, I Don't Know How But They Found Me, razzmatazz. I was worried that dynamic pop duo, I don't know how, would have lost their magic, but they certainly did not. In fact, this spells even better things for the band than their impressive debut EP. Through its theatric and vintage stylings, this takes you back to Broadway in the 70s, followed by a vintage casino with the bright lights shining everywhere. At the end of the day, though, this is some very fun pop rock with a lot of spirit behind it. Between the catchy hooks and instrumentals, I already cannot recommend this enough. But the way they write lyrics on here and the concepts they come up with makes me like it even better, making it really push over the edge for me to love this album. Number 9, Idles Ultra Mono. Yet another very 2020 album is the newest from Idles. They lyrically managed to be a voice for the oppressed in a riot-worthy way on this new record. Because of that, they clearly embody the punk rock edge that I think is so far missing in the current homogenized punk rock scene. But all that aside, these songs are absolute ragers. This one is so crushing with its massive riffs and slamming drums that rattle your brain throughout the chaos. This is the biggest album to revive a dying genre that I've ever seen, and it is doing that so well through the blend of punk that Idles is bringing on this record. Number 8, Dorian Electra, My Agenda. While we're on the topic of social commentary and music being pretty important, Dorian is here with their second album, their sophomore release, one that is very unapologetic with how they want you to perceive their agenda. They do not compromise with their identity on this album and are not afraid to show you who they are, and I really love that. That's a message I can get behind 100%. I also love the fun poked at incels on here. That's always a welcome addition to an album, and kind of the funny narrative that goes on throughout the whole thing about that. Aside from all of that, this is just so harsh and crushing sonically. It's just so destructive sounding, embracing some of the heaviest side of this type of music. I think I've brought it up every time I've talked about this album, but this just assaults your ears in the best possible way, a way that makes you want to replay the album and let your ears get assaulted again. But of course, really, what would be a message behind the lyrics that's this unapologetic if the sound didn't match it as well? Making me very glad that they do pair up quite well. Number 7, Black Dresses, Peaceful as Hell. And yet another really great final album is the band Black Dresses, the duo rather, Black Dresses, with their announcement that they were planning to disband the project shortly after their best album yet. Okay, so take everything I just said about that Dorian album and amp it up to 11 instead of 10. This set of lyrics is similarly down to earth, including themes of friendship, mental health, a lot of relatable topics like that, which is absolutely crazy because while a lot of those messages are even less dramatic, it sounds so much more crushing. It is somehow even more abrasive. Black Dresses do kind of embody that experimental progressive pop sound that we've mentioned a lot on here, that a lot of artists do incorporate, but then take a lot of different elements that are much heavier and much harder to deal with and put them on here as well, including a lot of metal influence, including some just crazy sounds that you wouldn't be expecting, ones that I can only describe as a 3-grit sandpaper synthesizer. This shit makes me worried that I am going to blow up my headphones, but other than that, it's always a very enjoyable experience. Number 6, Mac Miller, Circles. Next up is definitely the most tragic one on the list, a posthumous release and a very fitting one for Mac Miller, following up his last album that he released when he was with us called Swimming. Take some notes on this one, greedy label executives, because this right here is how you honor someone's legacy with music. This truly represents what I think Mac would have wanted, with this record taking so much delicate care. The production on here is done incredibly well. These beats are just stunningly perfectionistic with such honed detail. The way sound is treated on here is just angelic in general. Mac's mellow singing fills the otherworldly or otherwise spacey sound that the album presents. His writing on here is especially tear-jerking with just how relevant all of what he's talking about is in relation to what actually ended up happening to him. It kind of seemed like he knew what ended up happening would be a possibility, and it's very, very tragic to hear about now. Number 5, Rina Sawayama, Sawayama. Rina proved to be a force to be reckoned with in a lot of different ways on her debut album. Covering dance pop, nu metal, and just about anything in between, she embraces so many different styles on this album and pulls them all off very well. This is another one for the record books on just how great the lyrics are too. Talking about some relatable teenage antics, individuality, family relationships, and much more. This all feels like her self-portrait for one half of her self-title. Well practiced overall, and so is the way that this was produced. Another great thing is these closing tracks are some of the best that I've ever heard. The 2 songs that wrap up this album are amazing at doing so. This record is an experience that takes you many places, and all of those places are places you wanted to go. Number 4, Phoebe Bridgers, Punisher. What Phoebe presented us with this year is the best album to have a cry to, as I've explained before, and I still stand by that 100%. Her lyrics and peaceful instrumentals only grow on me with every single listen, now 10s or 20s later. This takes some of the simple ambience and stripped back sounds that I've mentioned with some of the other more mellow records on this list and makes the best use of it. It really is what this album doesn't do sometimes more than it is what it does do. It's so subtle but effective at doing that perfectly. Every lyric hits hard, and a lot of the catchy indie folk instrumentation does as well. This record has a unique feeling that just feels so special to me. It's a certain bittersweetness that you might have to hear to understand. Number 3, Clipping, Visions of Bodies Being Burned. What this record does with sound design and ambience is absolutely insane. This is much more like cinematic horror rap than it is horrorcore, because this isn't just some dude talking about murder. This is legitimately scary to listen to. The unconventional production styles enhance a very, very fantastic setting and experience. It never reaches the level of becoming a gimmick, which is very impressive. And beyond all that, Daveed Diggs is clearly the best rapper out there right now. No question about it for me. I cannot find anybody else out there who writes lyrics like this guy with such amazing descriptions and still can deliver his flows, his lyrics, all of his bars with such technical proficiency, whether it's speed, whether it's technical ability overall. Every word is so clear, and it makes it all the more frightening when he's so quickly describing all of these horrifying experiences. He's so good at placing you in the setting and then telling the story. The descriptions on here are vividly disturbing and really enhance the horror experience, and of course the way this album sounds does that as well. There are plenty of surprises on this album that are waiting for you, so next time there's a full moon and you feel like getting spooked, this is the best one to turn on. Number 2, HMLTD, West of Eden. This is one that makes me wish that I was doing the channel sooner, because I would have really liked to talk about this album when it came out, because it just blew my fucking mind. This may be the most innovative rock record of the last half decade, maybe even decade. This also pushes a lot of that socio-political lyricism that I talked about liking on some of the previous albums here that makes the record feel all the more important, most of which talks about the sorry state of Western leadership and the political corruption throughout. Sometimes something as personal, though, as gender identity issues. Almost no tracks tied together directly in their topics, but they all seem to fit really well under this umbrella of Western civilization not being as great as it seems. There are some real oddballs in the track list that do still kind of fall under that category, but aren't related to any of the things that I've already mentioned, and maybe more or maybe less personal than that. But the lyrics really take a backseat to the theatrical, dynamic, dramatic, and especially creative rock sound that is brought to us through this album. It varies through a ton of styles, including twangy western tunes to triumphant ballads to some hard rocking tracks. Despite all of that diversity, it really ends up coming together very harmoniously, and I have no idea how they managed to pull that off. This is a cohesive listen front to back. It feels that way every time, and I think that it's just the placement of the songs, but I can't be absolutely sure. It's great though. It's very impressive how well they managed to keep the consistency here. Really, most of what I love here is just how creative this is, because I am a strong embracer of creativity in music, and this album is gushing with it. Number 1, Run the Jewels, RTJ4. Who knew that the best album of the year would be given away for free just out of the kindness of the artist's heart? RTJ have been one of the biggest hip-hop duos in recent memory, or even maybe of all time, and they've been characterized as getting better every time they put out a record. With how good their original shit was, it was only a matter of time before they released something nearly perfect. Mike and LP are at their peak performance on this album, dropping many of their most memorable songs to date. This comes down to a variety of reasons, one of the most obvious being the immediately recognizable punchy hooks that bang throughout the tracks just often enough. Of course, you could also add up the fact that LP's production is just as great here as it's always been, but just a little bit better, as they do get better every time. He's got skills that have been honed for quite some time, bringing tons of amazing beats on this album, but it's also worth a mention how greatly written and how relevant the lyrics are on here. It is insane to think about the fact that Walking in the Snow was written before this year, even before the release of this album at all, just because of how much it correlates to the protests that went on this year. We could go into even more detail on a lot of the stuff that I love on this album, but I feel like I might have said enough already, so we'll just close this book by saying that RTJ aren't necessarily making something that's completely out of the ordinary for hip-hop, but they are the best ones currently doing it. Okay, wow, that was a lot. That was a lot right there. So if you needed any suggestions, you've got quite a lot right there. That's a lot of records I liked for you that came out this year. Plenty that are worth checking out. Thank you very much for being here with me this year through all of these records. It's been great to talk about them here and in other places on the channel, but that's all I got for you today. So drop a like on the video if you did like what you saw today. Subscribe to the channel for more music related content coming your way. Hit the bell for notifications on the same thing as well. But that is just about going to wrap it up for this one, and I will see you in the next video.